to sex and romance in games. So, I'm Nivedita. I'm the moderator. I am a queer Bengali writer of horror and dark fantasy, short fiction. All I have out there is short fiction, and though I am also working on my first interactive fiction game for something Strange Horizons is publishing next year, which Shahrung is editing. The thing. Um, I am coming at this mostly from the perspective of a writer and a player of games, with like very teeny baby steps in writing games recently. I would like you all to introduce yourselves as well. Why don't we go in the order on my screen, which would be Shahrung next.
So my name is Shahrung Biswas. I'm a game designer, writer, and artist. I'm also on the Faculty of Computer Science at Fordham University currently, and I am the game artist in residence at the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, New York. I have done a little bit of work writing erotic interactive fiction. I'm also the co-editor of with Lucian Khan of Honey and Hot Wax, an anthology of erotic art games published through Pelgrane Press, and the upcoming Strange Lusts, Strange Loves, an anthology of erotic interactive fiction with Cleo Davis, and that is coming to Strange Horizons this fall.
Awesome. Rebecca?
Hey, I am Rebecca Slitt, and I see that I did not put my pronouns on my screen name, pronouns she, her. I am, in addition to a player of all kinds of analog RPGs, I am an editor and partner at Choice of Games, which does digital interactive fiction, and more relevantly for this panel, our spin-off label, Heart's Choice, which does digital interactive romance novels. So I'm looking forward to talking about interactive romance fiction, as well as playing all sorts of other analog romance games.
Sweet. Bendy.
So I'm Bendy Barrett. I am a writer of speculative fiction and interactive fiction. I actually write for Choice of Games, so Rebecca and I encounter each other a lot. I also, under the pen name Benji Bright, write a lot of gay erotic interactive fiction, which I've been doing for, apparently the internet tells me, like 10 years. Yeah, I'm also a player of all sorts of games, analog, digital, the bandwidth, the whole breadth. So yeah, I'm very interested in the perspectives that we're all going to come from on this.
Yeah, that was something that super struck me when looking at the title. This is like sex or romance in games. That's huge, right? That encompasses interactive fiction, AAA titles, TTRPGs, board games. It's just so much. And so my first question is going to be a super general one. That it's a question for all of you. Just chime in as and when you like. And that question is, what are some of the ingredients, the necessary requirements to create a successful, however you define successful, and satisfactory sexual encounter or a romance arc in a game?
We all pause.
This is a lot, right? I'm guessing there's a lot of things to keep in mind. Just anyone.
I mean, okay, so going back to what you were just saying, a lot depends on the specific medium, because how you're going to be able to build a relationship and build a narrative arc depends on the tools that you have. I think one of the things that we can all speak to is, in a tabletop RPG, one of the most essential ingredients is another player who is willing to work with you and who you work well with and who you can build that story with. If you're dealing with a video game or interactive fiction, the ingredients are going to be a lot different, because you are going to, as a writer, you need to be the only one to give the player the tools that they will then be able to pick up in order to construct that fulfilling relationship within the fiction of the story.
And also, it's important to remember what your aim with the sex or sexual encounter or romantic whatever scene of desire is, right? Because I mean, there's that aphorism for writers, like, don't write sex scenes just for sex, write them, like, that's stupid, right? Like, most writers' rules that like most writers' rules can be bent and broken, right? Absolutely write a sex scene because you want a hot prince and the hot son of the American president having sex together, right? Rebecca knows what I'm talking about. Anyway,
Red, white, and royal blue. Go read it.
But it is still important to know why you're putting that scene in there, right? Are you putting it to titillate someone? Great. Well, then your aim is that, and you must write toward that. Are you putting it to show a difference in power in between the two characters? Great. That is what you're thinking of, right? And of course, we made a whole book with that various authors and games that contributed to, and in some of them, sex scenes are not about sex at all, right? In one of them, you can fondle another person's genitals, but it's about exploring alien landscapes that you are doing through this act of fondling someone's genitals, right? So I think then the concise form of that is think about the goal that your scene of desire, whether it is sex or not, has, and write/design with that goal in mind. But it's also okay for that goal to just be to make horny people happy or whatever. That's totally okay.
Make horny people happy. 2K21.
Also, wait, you guys.
Here we go. You did
You
it.
say that every time.
So I absolutely agree with the points that Shahrung has just made. And I actually have a talk a little bit later about how to why you might want to write a filthy game. One of spoiler, but one of the main reasons that I say is because horny. Like, you can just write a game because you that features sex and kind of is an erotic product just for no other reason than you want to make an erotic product. And I think that that first step into just the reason is that you want it to exist is so liberating. And I think it frees you from a lot of the kind of baggage of having to make sex answer for all of the injustices and ills of the world, and to calibrate it specifically to be as kind of perfect and uncomplicated and unmessy as possible. And if that's what you're trying to, if you come at it from that perspective, you just create this kind of sterile thing that's not hot for anybody. And then what was really the point? But I think that it makes a lot of sense that you want to come at whatever kind of romance or sex that you're writing with a very specific aim. And that was basically what I wanted to say. Just it could be horny. It could be horny. That's fine.
Sometimes people just be horny.
Oh, for those of you who are watching who don't know, right before we start talking, this is the symbol for horniness. Okay, so
it was decided before we started, in 2 minutes before we started. So,
and only a quick addendum to Rebecca Slip's comment is that if you're doing something which is about sharing stories with other players, then I would say one of the key things, I know all of us, I know I've talked with most of you about this at some point as well, is to have tools to communicate with each other what your aim is, right? Because everyone's experience of desire and sexuality is different, and more importantly, you don't know even your closest friends' experience and comfort level with desire and eroticism. So creating tools, if you're playing with someone else, again, very different, as Rebecca said, if you're playing with a computer. If you're playing with someone else who may be playing as a computer, but whatever, you need to have tools to be able to share either before or during, or I'm not going to prescribe, but to share how you want the scene to progress, whether or not you want the scene to stop, what you want in the scene. Having communication tools are very important. And I'm going to call them communication tools rather than the often described as safety tools, because I don't want us to be sex is inherently dangerous and you will die, right? That's why I'm calling them communication tools, so that you can calibrate and decide what it is you want.
Right, and you as an author have to do a lot of that because it's not a role play space that a lot of people have played in before. You have to approach every sexy or romancy role-playing game that you're writing as the first one that the player will have ever played of that type.
Right, you can assume previous experience.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe even in their real life, they haven't had a whole lot of experience communicating with a romantic or sexual partner. So they can't, so they can't even translate that experience from their real life into the game. So it's a big responsibility for us as authors to build that in so that our players can feel comfortable and empowered and to have as much fun with it as we want them to have.
Absolutely. Next one. Okay, I'm gonna lob. So we had like a great email discussion before the to stay, and based on some of the stuff that was brought up in our email, I'm gonna start lobbing some specific questions to you guys based on stuff you indicated. But I want to stress: feel free to then respond to each other and then jump in or have your own questions or comments or what have you. Okay, so I'm gonna start with Bendy. And the thing I want to bring up is, which dovetails perfectly with what we've been discussing, is the idea of consent, right? Because for me, it comes down to consent, and consent is sexy. Consent is so sexy, right? I mean, no shade on people who like dumb god. That is a kink. It is a legitimate kink. I support you and I respect you. But I'm so fascinated by how you negotiate consent, various levels of consent between like the creator and the player, or between multiple players, or between the player and the GM or DM, right? So I'm going to lob this question at Betty. Give us your thoughts.
So I think that I hope Rebecca is okay.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, hear you.
I hear you. Your video cut out, but we can hear you.
All of your video has frozen relative to me, so I think I'll get better in a minute. Keep on talking, and I'll just come back later.
Okay. So yeah, so I think consent is a really, really interesting kind of thing to navigate, especially as I think Rebecca was kind of pointing to as an author, as like when you are creating something, especially in kind of interactive fiction or in fiction that doesn't kind of lead to a tabletop experience where everyone can kind of advocate for themselves. I think you as the creator have to take on that role of I don't want to like sound paternalistic, but like you kind of are juggling kind of multiple hats, or that's a mixed metaphor. You're juggling multiple roles. Like, so you're creating it, and you want to create something that is maybe like hot, or in terms of like a romance, like really sweet, but you also want to kind of respect the fact, as Rebecca was saying, and I think as Shahrung was saying as well, that like this might be the first time someone is encountering something in a certain way, and so I think that as creators of work that is romantic and full of desire and full of sex, we kind of have a responsibility to make sure that people are enthusiastically opting into the scenes that that you write, and that beyond that they have a sense of what those scenes entail. Like, you shouldn't be, I think, going into a scene of desire kind of cold and then just kind of finding out what it entails. I think if you spend a lot of time on like the seedier sides of games that are just like written by people who don't necessarily have a sophisticated lens of desire, I think sometimes you or consent and desire, I think sometimes you encounter games that just kind of jump into the deep end, and it's just like sex is sex, and like that's fine, and you don't necessarily have the sense that there's like a list of things that you might encounter in certain scenes, or it's all just very like, this is just what you're gonna get. And I think those kinds of games have a place, obviously, but I think if we want the kind of, if we want to the realm of sex games or sex in games to progress past where it is, I think we have to kind of approach it with a little bit of nuance and kind of clarity and responsibility, and feeling like we're both responsible for providing like kind of really great content, but also we're responsible for the experience that people then have. And I think it's a kind of a weighty responsibility, and it's something that I've had to think a lot about, I think, in recent years, especially as kind of the nature of consent becomes this broader kind of social conversation.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
I think another thing that gets so I for the Moat platform, which is an upcoming platform that is going to be about using text to play role-playing game, it looks really cool. I was commissioned to write a game, and I wrote a game called Soul Specters, Gotta Love 'Em All, which is a game where in a world where it's about a world where everyone has their own like Pokemon like demon thing, like in Dark Materials kind of, called a Soul Specter, and when you go on a date with someone, your date is a gladiatorial battle between your Soul Specters, right? So it's like you fight and then flirt and fight and flirt, right? That's the gist of the game, right? But one of the things I discussed with the producers when I was making the game was, I'm like, okay, this is the game, and in the end, there's a bit where the loser, you play it over the internet, or you play over computer, so you're rarely physically with someone, and the loser of the Pokemon battle thing gets to decide how they get to be kissed, okay? Because that's what they get as a loser, right? And one of the questions the producers had for me was, should we make the kissing part an optional thing, right? Should we say, players, you get to decide whether or not you want to kiss? And I decided in our discussion, we had a really fruitful discussion, is that rather than say, by the way, this kiss is optional, I put at the start of the game, this is the content of this game. There is this and there is a kiss at the end. You decide as players how much of this you want to do, how much you want to change, and whether or not you even want to play this game, right? Because one of the things I see that goes on a lot is when we have discussions of consent and when we have discussions of content warnings, sometimes the conversation veers into infantilizing our audience and assuming they cannot make decisions on their own, right? Well, my viewpoint is we must always inform the audience what is the content of this game, and inform them, especially this is not a video game where they can't hack the code, and sometimes you can still hack the code, right? There's an analog role-playing game where you can make decisions about what things you want to include or not. My responsibility, I feel, is I want to tell you these things because sometimes we demonize sexuality too much. And I felt by saying, oh no, there's kissing in the end, this might be optional because it might traumatize you, is a way that we contribute to this culture of saying kissing and sexuality is something that must be tread on with eggshells and is not a experience that humans, naturally may have like encounters with. Right? Even if you're asexual, you have some relation to sexuality, right? In an ace relationship, but it exists, right? I always I'm always like, you need to have communication tools. You need to inform people about content because yes, we know sexual content is sensitive, but you also need to treat your audience as people who can make decisions about what they're going to play and what they're going to consume.
And on a purely more technical perspective, I assume it saves you having to then code multiple options into the game. Where it's like, no, my game does not include those options. Here's what it includes. I'm going to let you know upfront, so you can decide if this is your jam or not.
Exactly, and people make changes to games all the time without the designer telling them, right? They're like, you know what, we're just gonna change this and go this way, right? Or I'm gonna make everyone dudes in this game, in this role-playing game, go, because we want to play a gay orgy game, whatever, right? So yeah.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
were you going to say?
Yeah. So building on that, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective as an author of choice-based interactive fiction. So first of all, everything that I write and in the games that I edit has to be pre-written by me. The player chooses which of those options they engage in, but I have to write it all. So there's a lot more responsibility on the writer to present a range of potential ways of interacting with the content. but it's also an opportunity to give the player multiple chances to give affirmative consent. You know, so you can have a really a very step-by-step choreographed scene. One of our games, A Player's Heart, has this classic scene where you have the sexually charged sword fight.
Does someone tilt their rival's chin up with a sword?
Yes, yes, sword under the chin and lifting the chin up. It's amazing. Anyway, so
here for this.
Yes. So as the sword fight is progressing, there is a series of choices where, like, okay, you can feel the temperature sort of rising. How do you feel about that? And you can choose to escalate or de-escalate multiple times during that scene. So if you decide you do want to engage further with a romance with this other character, you can do that. And you as a player and as a character get to be more empowered in the relationship by choosing to act. And you, the player, are also empowered by choosing not to. If you decide, okay, I'm done, I'm ending the match and going home, you can do that. So it gives a lot of responsibility on the author to present those options, but then the player can take that agency and take those situations as far or as not far as they want.
Another good example of that is in the video game Hades, right? So there are a couple of romanceable characters. I won't tell you if you haven't played Hades yet, though many of you probably have. And
if you haven't, you should.
You all should if you haven't. I play easy mode, so you should all play easy mode if you don't want to, if it's hard. And there are moments where these characters will approach you, and I think that is the only narrative choice you have in the entire game. The game does not give you narrative choices. The game gives also gameplay choices, right? Is when one of the romanceable characters comes to you and asks you if you want to have a night, it's the underworld, it's always night, have a moment of passion with them. And then it goes into this incredibly fun, nice fade to black scene. But and you can say yes or no, right? Kind of what Rebecca Slitt was saying, and that's lovely. And that's different from what I was saying with tabletop role-playing games, where you are co-creating live. But in this sort of example, the author has created something for you, so you should be able to let them not partake in this or partake to the degree they feel comfortable in order to move. It would be poor form, I would say, to make a game where in order to progress, you must have sex with this character. With that, if you did that, yeah, but you'd have to like tell someone very early on of the game that this game has like a sex scene that you must go through. And of course, that is cultural, right? We don't put that same logic to violence. We never say, oh, we have to tell people if you have to kill someone to go through. Many games, you have to kill someone to go through, and that is a cultural shift, cultural thing. But it would be poor form to have someone go through a sex scene in a video game in order to finish without telling them beforehand this is either the case or giving them the option of modding and opting out.
Yeah, and someone who plays a lot of D&D, like so much D&D, it's why things like session zeros are so important. Because like, like just talk to your players, talk to each other, ask them what kind of game they want, because every player wants something different. Like like I've had game group mismatches because somebody wanted more action, somebody wanted more RP. The DM was picturing a grimdark adventure, the players were just fucking around having fun. The DM was very exasperated, right?
And there's nothing wrong with any of those desires, right?
Right. It's just communicating what you want.
Yeah.
Making sure you're on the same page of what your desires and your goals. And especially with regard to like things like sex scenes. Like,
yes.
Is this okay? Can we go further? Should we cut to black? Such. Shahrung, you were mentioning analog games earlier, which gets me thinking, and this is something you mentioned. How do you? Well, it's obviously if you have a AAA game with like a beautiful graphically designed text scene rolling on screen, that's one thing, right? How do you do that in an analog game, like a board game or a card game?
Right. So There are a lot of ways to do it, right? Because we tend to think of, again, when we think of analog games, we tend to think of like D&D, right? Which is great, but that's just one model, right? There are lots of games that do a lot of different things with sex and sexuality. I'm going to give a self-call. Check out Honey and Hot Wax, Anthology of Erotic Card Games, edited by Shahrung Biswas and Lucian Khan. We got 2 grants from a foundation from the Effing Foundation for Sex Positivity, specifically to explore how can you expand what analog games, in this case mainly LARP, though some of them verge into TTRPG territory. I'm not a genre gatekeeper or a style gatekeeper, but I'm going to say most of them are a bit more live action. And you can do a lot of things. So I'm going to give an example. So for example, right, this game is not from this anthology. There's a game called My Girl Sparrow by Troils Peterson, I think, where it is a game. I won't get to all of it, but it's a lot about these sex scenes that you have. And when you have a sex scene, you will clasp the person with whom you're having sex. Multiple people is a different rule, but if it's 2 people, you clasp their hand and look into their eyes, and there's a very formulaic way you exchange sentences back and forth. So I will say a call and you will say a response, and you will say a call and I will say a response, and you will get very graphic. So I'm going to get very graphic for a moment on this panel, where I might say something like, I lick your nipple slowly, and then you will say something like, I moan loudly, right? So that is one way. And the cool thing about this game, since we're talking about the technologies of analog games, is in this game, My Girl Sparrow, you are never allowed to describe your interiority or your feelings. So the game does not let you say, I liked that. The game lets you say, I purr softly, right? The interesting thing is, your partner may have no clue what you're trying to do, what you're trying to communicate that, which is like real life in a way, right? Like if someone squeals, you're like, oh, was that a good squeal, a bad squeal, okay squeal, a tickle squeal? I have no idea, right? And the game explores this concept of how in current Western discourse and language, we have a lot of ways of describing feelings, but we don't want to describe sexuality a lot, right? And there's other layer in this game of, are you liking what I'm doing? I have no idea, because you are not allowed to tell me. All you can tell me is I shiver, or I blink rapidly, or my lips quirk upwards. You cannot say, right? You can't say I moan happily. No, right? You have to say I moan. And then sometimes when you play the game, you see the other person thinking, oh no, what am I going to say? Quickly, rapidly, and then you're like, what does that mean? I don't know, right? And so that is an example of a game that, using the technologies, using the affordances of the analog space, becomes a very interesting analysis and exploration of sex scenes, desires, and communication, right? And there are lots of examples of games that, I'm not going to go into all of them, lots of examples of games, of analog games, that use different restrictions, use different techniques. They make you use hand motions. They make you do different things with cards to represent various aspects of desire. And I know Rebecca Slater has played a number of LARPs that has like romance elements in them as well, right?
Yeah, some of the games that I was going to think, building on a different aspect of restriction and exchange, thinking about some of the earliest tabletops and LARPs to really focus on romance, Breaking the Ice by Emily Care-Boss. Her romance trilogy just came out in a 2nd edition that I edited, which is why it's which is why it's very forward in my mind. Anyway, yeah, tons of spinoffs. Anyway, so Breaking the Ice is a 2-player game centering around a series of dates. And the character creation process is very, very minimal. And you just choose a very small array of traits for your 2 characters. But they're all based on ways in which your character is similar to yourself or different from yourself, similar to the other player, different from the other player. And so it's building that intimacy between the characters based on what the players know about each other and based on what the players are saying to each other about themselves. So it's not quite having real life mirror what's going on in character, but it's priming your mind to think about those things by the act of the character creation process. And by paring it down to such a relatively small number of traits, you're making each one feel very, very important, which it kind of mirrors the experience of going on a first date. Like, you only know 2 things about the other person. And so these are like the 2 most important things about that person until you learn more.
I love that.
Quick addendum, unless Ben wants to chime in.
I was
No,
gonna
please go
ask
ahead.
if
One of the things that one of the starting points for Honey and Hot Wax when Lucian and I conceived of the project was, in addition to some of these things, was to also think about, in the analog game space, can you actually use sex acts that players do with each other as a game mechanic, right? Because we think about lots of role-playing games that use various other kinds of verbs as game mechanic. Like there's a winner of a 200-word con that uses the act of dropping ink into a tumbler as a conflict resolution mechanic, right? Like, when you can no longer see the coin because the water is too inky, that means something, right? And so we were thinking about, like, can you use sex acts as this? And obviously, that means that you have to talk a lot with the other players beforehand. Like, is this a game you want to play? Are you someone I'm comfortable doing this with in this context, right? Like, for example, my partner, who I have had sex with a lot, was like, I don't want to play any of these games with you, right? Because he didn't want to play. He didn't want to have sex with me in this fictional role play context thing, right? Even though, we also do role play in our TMI, but right, you have to communicate what you're comfy with, right? So, but once that's handled, we were very interested, like, can sex acts themselves mean something else in this game, right? Like the game about fondling someone, you physically fondle someone's genitals and then start describing, like, the crater of the moon that you're visiting, right? Or like the dark, forbidden temple that you're exploring, right? Because and there's I'm not going to go into all the details about that because I'm not the author of that game. I mean, I know the author very well. But there's a lot of artistic reasons, artistic things you can do with, I am doing this one thing with you and to you, but fictionally it means something else, right? And that also is potent and powerful. Or we hope it's potent and powerful, which is why we made the book. So.
Yeah. Bendy, is there anything you want to add to all of that?
I don't have as much experience in the tabletop realm, and I've never done LARP. So, like, hopefully when like at the next con where I see any of you, we'll like figure something out. So that sounds
Oh,
perfect.
yes.
But what I kind of have been picking up is, like, there seems to be in the games that you've been describing, there seems to be a kind of like these kind of shorthands for intimacy. And do you guys see it that way? Do you see the reduction of a relationship down to these kind of very small essentials, and kind of, or in Shahrung, in your case, the holding hands and just like speaking very direct lines? Do you think that that's kind of because I think one of the things that we're talking about is kind of like the kind of expansiveness of sexuality and how we can't necessarily capture that all at once. Do you think that is kind of related? I don't know if I'm like putting this correctly, but do you think that is, we're trying to like align that messiness with these kind of shorthands, or do you think that that's a way to kind of represent the unknowns of a romantic or sexual interaction? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I hear it. And I think you're right. Like, one of the challenges is that there are so many different ways to express sexuality and so many different ways to enact it and to enact emotion and to experience it. And in the context of a game, we have to do that all very, very quickly. Like, an actual intimate relationship might take a really long time to build up. And when you only have, a few hours to play a game, you need to figure out how to distill that and magnify it and choose what you're going to do. Which is why, in some games, like they lean really hard into the tropes. Like, when I was talking about, the sword fight, and it's immediately said, like, oh, did you do the sword? Tropes are so handy for this. And I think you can get, you get some of that with the tropes of physicality as well. So drawing on these forms that are already embedded in the player's minds.
It's vocabulary. It's existing vocabulary.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, to take their existing vocabulary, they already know what that means, and they already know how that makes them feel emotionally and physically. And so it's a way to accelerate that process so that you can get to the part of the process that you really want to play.
Right, and like it is this distillation and simulation conjoined, like done together, that is where the artistry of game design, I think, lies, right? I mean, there's a lot going on, but that's one of the ways the artistry of game design lies, right? Because Frank Lance has this lovely talk. He's the chair of the NYU Game Center currently, and he has this lovely talk called the Immersive Fallacy, right? Where he talks about, like, games aren't meant to be perfect simulations of the world, because then they're not games, then they're the world, right? And if the idea is to communicate something, the idea is to communicate it in a certain way, with a certain viewpoint, with a certain degree of speed, and that's where a game mechanic comes in, right? Like, this mechanic stands in for this much more, everything a game stands for is much more complex than in the game, right? Shooting someone, there's a lot more going on after you shoot someone than just shooting someone, right? Which is one of the most common mechanics in games. What's it called? The power, like what Bendy's question, I think, is where the power of games lies, right? Simplifying and putting in a certain light one aspect of desire, romance, etc. Excuse me. That becomes the way that the designer author communicates a specific viewpoint, not through necessarily explicit words, but through permission to perform certain action in a certain way.
Does it answer your question, Bendy?
It does. It does. Thank you.
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that. I am learning so much in this panel as a very, very small newbie game writer. Rebecca, you brought up tropes, which is just the perfect segue. This is exactly what I needed. It's like tropes, we know and we love them. What are tropes, romance tropes that translate well into games, and some that don't?
Yeah, this is also coming out of our pre-conference discussion. And yeah, I said some of the, I already got a chance to say some of the things that I was hoping to say, which is, tropes are good because they are, this pre-existing vocabulary. And some of the joy of using tropes is sort of like hearing a familiar song, and when it comes up, you know where it's coming from. Like you recognize the tune, and it gives you the emotional feeling that it always does every time you hear it. And so that's why, as a romance novel reader, and as a fanfic reader, which, there's a lot of crossover with the tropes. So, you can tell if there's going to be a scene coming where there's only one bed. It's a common trope, and you can see that coming. And part of the fun of, your two characters are trapped in trapped in a snowstorm, and
let's cuddle together to share body heat.
Exactly, and only one bed, and that's coming. And when you see the story play out the way it will, it makes you happy because that is fulfilling your expectation. And so we can use those words and bits of narrative song in our games to do that. The flip side is there are other tropes that don't necessarily translate as well. And one of the ones that I often struggle with in Heart's Choice games in particular is enemies to lovers. That one's particularly, like, it's a hard sell for me as a reader to begin with, but I found that it doesn't translate well to games, and particularly not to pre-scripted interactive fiction, because of all of the consent and design issues that I was talking about before. If a character is treating you, if you're writing a linear novel, you can write enemies to lovers because you can show the two characters learning about each other. You are the one writing their emotions, and you can decide that what they see about the other person changes the way they feel. You don't get to choose that for your player. Your player always gets to choose that for themselves. And so it's really hard. I just generally advise my authors don't even try, because what's more likely to happen is that they will see this person being a jerk, and they will just think, well, that character is a jerk. I'm not going to interact with them anymore.
Yeah, I've found that, like, I play a lot of choice of games, right? I play a lot of, like, Rebecca's work. Specifically, I have played Rebecca's work, but I've played a lot of choice of games, and I have found that when you're in this first-person mindset of, okay, I'm this character, blah blah, it's much, for me, and maybe for other people, it is much harder to be, let me analyze this other character's interiority to see what they're about before I make my next choice, right? I never do that. I'm like, slap you.
They were mean to me.
Horrible, right? I mean, and that's something that you have to think about in terms, like, the form of interactive fiction means that players often want to read the thing and then immediately make the choice. Rarely are they going to be like, let me look at the psychology of this character, blah, 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 blah. Cool.
Well, but not always. So that's another thing that you need to account for when you're writing these games is the range of experiences and approaches that your players are going to bring to it, because some people absolutely do overanalyze, and for all I say that, I'm not going to write an enemies to lovers. In my own first game, Sci-Hi, there was the mean girl character, and like one of the top comments I got was, why can't I romance her?
Oh, really?
To you.
Some people are into that. Some people are into that.
So perfect. So perfect. I just really quickly wanted to add that, like, I think that, like, as a writer who I don't typically write romance, and I think early in my career I kind of like was like, oh yeah, but like it's just like formulaic and there's just so many tropes and I don't know, until I realized that, like, writing gay erotic work, it's all tropes. It's tropes all the way down, it's like if you're writing like all the hot jocks and the hot sailors and the coaches and the, like, it's like all the hot blanks, it doesn't matter. It's like our, like, erotic imaginations are so full of these archetypes that, like, there's really no escaping them. And I think that once you kind of just realize that and you acknowledge that, like, it's a freeing effect. Like, you kind of, like, it makes your work better as a writer, and I think it makes you more able to, like, take the lens, like Rebecca was saying, like, oh yeah, like, maybe the fact that, like, people are, like, attracted to this mean girl character is just because it's just another trope. It's just another character that has, like, been floating around their subconscious, and maybe, like, that's, like, when we talk about the personal experience that people are bringing in, maybe, like, during their high school experience, like, that was the character that they were drawn to, but weren't able to, like, they couldn't, like, get there. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that the reliance on tropes is a sort of shorthand, because we don't, if we wanted to like build every single character from scratch and make every single character feel like an authentic, totally new, fresh experience, I mean, you would never get done writing that work, because you'd be reinventing the wheel at every step, and it'll probably honestly just look like not everything else, but it would probably just you just end up recreating the tropes from scratch, and it's like, why waste the time?
And literary fiction writers very often love this idea that, oh, genre fiction has tropes.
It's
Literary
formulaic.
fiction has tropes. Literary fiction is a genre. It has its own tropes. It has its own styles. The fact that it's not called a genre and everything else called genre fiction is strange. So just keep that in mind. Like, just because a genre has tropes, you might not like those tropes, which is obviously your right, but doesn't mean like leaning on trope whatever is bad. And in games, tropes are also very good ways of giving players a way to know how to act next, right? Especially in role-playing games that are not computer games. Sometimes like you have infinite freedom, right? You're like, well, what do I do? Okay, well, I'm playing the himbo paladin character. So what tropish? What would he do next? He would do this. I don't know what he actually would do. I have never been a himbo paladin. I don't live in the Middle Ages. Rebecca might. She has studied the Middle Ages a lot.
We lived in the Middle Ages.
But so because I don't know that, I will then rely on tropes to inform how I continue in this game. Right. So tropes are not a bad thing.
Right, and which is why role-playing systems like the Powered by the Apocalypse are so effective, because their playbooks are very, very strongly organized around a character type. So giving you a set of moves and backgrounds and
powers,
and powers, and they're very, very tropey, and they all combine to give you an idea of, what do I do in this situation? What are the actions available to me? And that, and that translates to in the romance heavier ones, like Monster Hearts is another one of my favorite games all time.
I would love to play Monster Hearts with y'all, just saying.
Next time we are all in the same place, we are playing Monster Hearts together.
Absolutely.
I'm
so ready.
Yeah. In the audience, if you're at this panel, you probably know Monster Hearts, but just in case you don't, it's by Avery Alder. It is a game about messy teen monster relationships. And the playbooks are like the vampire, the werewolf, etc.
It's held up as a pinnacle of like queerness and game design. So
absolutely.
Every character, every player type has a sex move.
Yeah, that is exactly where I was going. And so it's all, and they're all dysfunctional. Which is the point of the game, which is it is about teenage sexuality, which is messy and confused and confusing, and you do not have the emotional competence yet to have a decent relationship. And the sex moves are all about the messiness of your particular archetype. And so it's a really great example of how sex and romance and relationships get encoded in the game mechanics in such a way as to help you build a character and to help you understand what the game is about.
We are coming up on our end time. I do see a question in chat, so I'm going to read that out if anyone want to jump on it. And the question is, how do the panelists feel about games that give you only one person to romance versus being able to romance anyone you want, or a large selection? Also, is this something you've seen changing over time?
I think what do you feel about it? I think that's totally an artistic choice, right? Like, and both from the creator side and the consumer side. Do I want to play a game about a specific character I'm romancing? Great, I'll play this game. If I want to play a selection game, then probably play one of Rebecca's games, for example, right? Yeah. The other thing that's related to that is the idea of polyamory. Something that I see when there's a large selection is usually once you romance one person, you're locked in with them. And I'm really excited when authors don't do that. So when Cleo Young
also Hades.
Right, in Hades you can do that, or when in Choice of Game, when Cleo Yunsu Davis and Fog Knows Your Name makes explicit polyamory ops, you can date more than one person. I was unsuccessful in doing so, but whatever. You can. I love that because it makes me feel more like, yeah, I don't have to date just one person. But again, all that's an artistic choice. And
they also say technical limitations also. Poly is so hard to code. Oh my gosh, the continuity testing on that.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
All right. As we're wrapping up, any final thoughts?
Support indie game designers who make games about romance and sex.
I will just say, like, thank you for having me on this panel, and like, I think I've like learned so much about just everything. So just thank you, all fellow panelists.
Yeah,
this was informative and helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to all of you, and I also learned a lot. And yeah, let's talk more about this.
And also thank you to our audience for giving us attention and putting up with us doing silly things.
It's been a long day.
It's been a long weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So in closing out, where can we find you on the internet and your work?
Okay.
Let's go again the order on my screen, which would be Shahrung first.
So my name is Shahrung Biswas. My Twitter is @Shahrung Biswas. That will link to my website, which has not been updated in a while because of COVID. It's shahrungbiswas.myportfolio.com. And my itch.io, which have some of my games, including one about taking your clothes off in front of someone else because you're demigods, is astrolingus.itch.io. But yeah, Twitter is where I'm very, very active, and you can link to my website from there.
Awesome. Rebecca?
Hi, you can find me on Twitter @Becky's Games, and if you are interested in Heart's Choice, you can find that at heartschoice.com, or Choice of Games, which also has a lot of romantic, not romance only, but some romantic games at choiceofgames.com.
Sweet. Betty?
And you can find me at my website is benmakesstuff.com, and you can find me on Twitter at @bendied, or bendied. I don't want to talk about that again. It's supposed to be bendied because my name is Bendy, and it's add an ed, and I thought it would be cute, and then people were like, "Why'd you die?" And I was like, "I don't know."
I just got that.
If you're interested in my like erotic fiction work, it would be you can find some like a section of that stuff at benjibright.itch.io. Yeah.
Awesome. And I am on Twitter as HER_Nibsen, her Nibsen. And my website is nibetitasen.com, which is also linked to on my Twitter profile. All right. Well, this has been fun. I've learned so many things. This was great. Thank you guys. Thank you, audience, for being here. Thank you guys for being wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Woo! Hey, guys.